welcome, and really excited to talk to you because this book that you've written now, I think about 10 years ago, maybe more.
Yeah, 2016 it came out. Yes.
It's really, a wonderfully written book, and something that is, I think, very worth reflecting on in our current moment of, kind of a continuum of fossil fuel addiction in Canada and a kind of doubling down, which you talk about in the book. But I asked you to kind of, reflect on this coming 10th anniversary of the book in relationship to a new text that just came out from Roy Scranton called Impasse, which is, basically about the limits of progress. So like similarly trying to think about what you call the kind of modern ship, modernity, as this kind of, in some ways, ecological dead end. And there's a moment toward the end of your book where you say that it's possible that a, quote, deluge of pain may well mark the passage to reconsidering our choice of direction. But that, for you, is only the pessimistic side of the story. Because we've seen, as you say, that there's also a more ancient connecting etiquette that we can draw on. There's a lot there, but it made sense to me to sort of try and bring your two books into conversation with one another on this question of pessimism, right? Because Scranton, in a way, is avowedly pessimistic, saying things like what he calls ethical pessimism is a commitment to future existence that by definition cannot be imagined. You're saying something certainly a little bit different in your book. Can you maybe speak to where you're at in relationship to that projection into a future, and how you kind of feel like your affective kind of orientation has a lot of weight when it comes to doing that work of kind of projecting into multiple possible futures,
Yeah. No. Thanks for that question, Scott. I guess I'd kind of start off with there's different kinds of knowledges there, and when I read Scranton's work, I drew upon many similar sources. Tainter's work on collapse of civilization, and Scranton draws a lot on those on that literature, and also the need to have a more nuanced sense as what we're talking about when we use a word like collapse. It doesn't necessarily mean the kind of apocalyptic sensibility that is part of the Christian tradition. There are other cultural traditions that have a much more kind of cyclical sense of how change operates, both individually, but in relation to cultures, in relation to the changes of the seasons, and thinking about the changes of the seasons in relation to the change of cultural forms. And so when I'm reading Scranton's book, he's definitely opening up this sense of that ethical pessimism about how what is our present moment, and there's clearly some kind of major change that is happening. And then at the same time, one of the things that I kind of struggle with in his work, especially towards the end of that first chapter or so, when he's talking about Indigenous perspectives on this and how Indigenous peoples have been sustainable historically. But we have to rethink what that means. It's in a particular localized context, and even the critique of the term Indigenous, and recognizing different Indigenous peoples. To bring up all of that nuance, but he does come to this kind of either or perspective on Indigenous, where it's like, okay, well, if we're going to learn from Indigenous peoples and we're going to learn what their traditions can teach us about sustainability, and recognizing that we can't actually go back anymore. The size of our populations, the technological realities we're dealing with, all of that. So he kind of comes to this bypass and said, well, to engage Indigenous in that context, and suggest that there's something we can bring back, is also to suggest the amount of pain that's going to require, so the amount of loss that we're basically going to be dealing with. and the impacts on whole populations of people. And in many ways, different communities around the world are dealing with those kinds of changes already. But there's kind of I kind of felt when I was reading that kind of conclusion, um, it felt like a bit of a trap,
Mm.
where it's like we almost can't go and reclaim aspects of those indigenous traditions because it takes us too far from where we need to go. And I tend to think about in most of the work that I'm doing is that there's an in-between space. There's a space where we can come into like a really important dialogue, and that the dialogue, as opposed to a debate, is about a kind of it's a kind of communication, and that communication can actually transform how we're thinking about our response to the changes that are happening around us, and actually to understand the changes of climate change as a kind of dialogue, as the world actually responding to us in a kind of communication. And so we need to actually bring our perspectives into a more fluid dialogue with that. And so, but so much of the research that I've done is about fostering those kinds of dialogues across cultural traditions.
Hmm.
And it's never about going back. Like
Right.
it's about like, okay, what does this mean going forward? And I have all kinds of different examples where I could talk about that. And I don't know if there's particular things that you find interesting around that.
I
Um,
mean, yeah, I wonder. I mean, the image that comes to mind in terms of moving forward is the Kanaka Maoli, Indigenous Hawaiian, saying I forget exactly how it goes. Basically, sort of like walking backwards into the future, like bringing tradition into the future. And I take your point that in Scranton's ethical pessimism, it's not a question of whether the future may have this deluge of pain. It's almost guaranteed for him. And so there's really no room for hope. And there's
yeah,
also thus no room for talk. Like he basically castigates anyone who imagines a discursive response to the climate emergency. And as a person that believes firmly in the power of language, that didn't sit too well. But
yeah,
there's a lot in what you just said, especially this idea that like collapse is not apocalypse, right? Like I think there's absolute alignment in terms of the two arguments that you're making. Like he says collapse itself is an adaptation. I think this is interesting. He says like people can choose to collapse and may begin to disintegrate through political disaffiliation well before disaster strikes, detaching from
yeah,
centralized bureaucracies. I mean, we're kind of seeing that with the rise of Trumpist, like
yeah,
eco-fascism in the States, this kind of dissolution of decentralized bureaucracies. That's a choice to collapse in a sense. And that is a specific political conjuncture that it feels like we ought to be able to act back against. But Scranton doesn't seem to provide a lot of room for that sort of agency, that coming together, that convergence. But you're saying you believe in it, right? Like there's a moment here where you say in your book, to choose nature even in times of turbulence is seemingly to be against the human needs of their communities and national culture. That is that moment for me where you're kind of wrestling with the tension between these two things. Could you speak to that like tension of choosing nature as a feeling of like kind of almost abandoning human infrastructure, right? Going into the
yeah,
woods, trying to escape. Like, can that be
yeah.
responsible in a sense?
Yeah. Well, it's like that book. Most of it was written outside.
Okay.
I do almost all my writing outside for the books that I'm working on now. Even when I write academic articles, the articles are usually to feed into books, like because I want to try to think about a narrative, a story. And so to go out, so I'm in Toronto. I'm in the West End of Toronto. It's like, well, where's there to go write a nature in Toronto if you're not from Toronto? But along
Mm.
all the riverways that were here, the Humber River, the Don River, there are ravine systems, and then there are green park systems. And so I go into those. I go into those spaces to write and to think, and I bring my writing back there to read it to the place. as a way to engage. And one of the things that again, because I've been engaging with Indigenous community perspectives and elder knowledge and traditional knowledge for about 30 years, ever since I was a social worker working in the north of Northern Labrador and Inuit communities. And then that led to my earlier research with Inuit perspectives on climate change. Um, One of the things that really struck me, especially coming from, I originally had a master's in social work before going and doing a PhD in environmental studies. Uh, like when I was there, people would talk about how when they're connected to the land, like when they're actually out on the land, they feel more whole. They feel some of the uh, impacts of colonialism that have happened, the institutional impacts, and dealing with various addictions, you know, all the things related to child welfare, young offenders, all that kind of stuff, programs that I dealt with. But they would talk about going out into nature, and they got a sense of who they are. And I was like, well, we had none of that being talked about in the early '90s in my education as a social worker. And as I started re-engaging that and just even thinking about like my father just loved going out fishing and doing stuff like that. And like, what was that? What was that about? And, you know, I never really enjoyed it, but that was central to him. I just realized, I actually feel good out in nature.
Hmm.
I feel different. I feel a certain decompression from the society around me. Whether it be in a university setting where all the administrative responsibilities kind of impact you, or living in Toronto, the speed of the roads, the way in which we kind of drive past everything. So there's a spot where I go that overlooks. You can see Lake Ontario over top, 16 lanes of traffic that separate that green space from the lake. The Gardiner Expressway, the Lakeshore, the Queensway, and then there's also the railroad, and so that's all separated.
Hmm.
But when I'm there, I get a sense of the ravine and the texture of the land. I start feeling a little bit different,
Hmm.
and there's a kind of there's a different way of processing what's going on. And then I can actually, as I start getting a sense of the ecological history of that particular place and some of the different ways in which people have engaged over time, and I spent a lot of time in that book
Hmm.
recovering those kinds of knowledges from early conservationists to indigenous perspectives. It opens up a different sense of what that land is, and so then the relations there start actually speaking to me as well. And I was like, oh, I need to know more about heron, or I need to know more about this particular ravine, or I need to know more about, Lake Ontario and all of that. And so there's an opening to a different way of knowledge. That's just not book knowledge, but the place itself starts uh, teaching you something, and
Hmm.
it's teaching you the knowledge that goes beyond the head and actually brings it into the heart. Uh, and so that's where hope comes from. So when I look at all the more recent research, and I do this with my social work students, we spend a lot of time. They have to go engage every class. They have to go out and have a sit spot in the place where they live.
Hmm.
I talk about it. The two-row wampum, one of the first treaties, at least in the lands where I am here in eastern and southern Ontario, speaks about the Indigenous Canadian or Western European relationship. And there's these two rows, the ship, which I refer to in the book in relation to industrial Canadian culture, and the Indigenous canoe, but they're also in this backdrop of white. And in my work with Norma Jacobs, who's a Cayuga elder and draws upon that two row teaching a lot, she talks about that white is the river of life, and we're also in a relationship with that river of life. So it's not just the two rows; it's the two rows and the world around us. And then there are these values: respect, friendship, peace. That friendship is an important piece. Like, so think about friendship with people, like what it actually takes to foster friendship, to not be in a utilitarian relationship around the friendship. You accept them as who they are. You travel with them over your life. You give time and space to just be with each other and hang out. So I talk to students about you need to actually create space in your lives to just get a different sense of this land
Hmm.
and to actually foster a kind of friendship. If you actually go in and then let the place start kind of pose questions to you, it's going to pose you questions to actually learn something more about where you are.
Yeah.
You learn about more about who you are. And so anyway, so you go into this kind of relationship, and it opens up another way of knowing. So there's a whole other possibility. What when you start doing that, that's when you actually start able to kind of think about that in relation to all the recent research that's coming out on how being in place to help deals with mental health benefits. There's all kinds of research on potentially engaging land around addictions, depressions, and then also what's neurobiologically happening within the brain.
Hmm.
Uh, but though that research draws upon, things that people have been doing across cultures for a very, very long time. And that's the kind of stuff I think that Scranton is getting, yeah, or at least he doesn't go directly to. But when you're talking about collapse of civilization, you're talking about different perspectives on that. You're talking about people's relationship or indigenous relationships with land and with place. You're talking about a quality of relationship that is important to be thinking about and that can be brought back into our current lives. And those relationships can actually bring a sense of hope.
Hmm.
Uh, the hope is not some kind of Pollyanna hope. It's not like, oh, I'm sitting here and saying, oh, everything's going to be great. Let's just keep on going the way we're going. It's more along the lines of the way we're at the very beginning of Scranton's book. He draws upon that upon I think it's the Hopi sense of the Chacoan culture
Hmm.
that collapsed, and they referred to them as Anansi, which was the great gamblers.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so it was another indigenous cultural perspective on that culture
Hmm.
as to a way of living that was kind of gambling with the future. Was that there's a systemic way of always engaging the
Yeah.
world as opposed to relational.
Hmm. Hmm.
So when I engage indigenous knowledge, what I'm interested in is there are aspects, the in between that I'm talking about is that there are aspects of stuff that we now know in relation to our research that we could actually recover, and it can actually tell us that we need to change how we're behaving, like how we're operating in the world.
Hmm.
Um, and so, how do we actually foster that? I try to foster that in my classes, and so a kind of hope that is optimistic, but that is not you know just romantic.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in what you just said. I mean, lots of stuff is coming up for me in terms of just like, trying to encourage people to engage with the land so that they can develop some sense of care for it, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing automatic about that practice. But I think you're right to sort of stress that, like, if it is regarded as a practice, then hope can be the product. Like hope is the practice in some sense, right? It's like you get to that point. But you said something really, yeah, remarkable there about like gambling with the future. It feels as though the dominant extractivist worldview is entirely about that. It's entirely about sort of gambling with the future, not really accepting that the odds are stacked against us, that there's, that physics and science, like there's ways in which like it's just going to continue hitting back. And yet, you talk a lot about technology as the means through which we often sort of gamble away the future. And I wondered if we could maybe, because I read, for example, the Red Deal very closely, which is this kind of indigenous manifesto for a post-capitalist climate future. And one of the things they really, underline in that book over and over again is the idea that, a river in some sense is a technology. If you want to kind of expand the concept of technology,
Yeah.
there are ways in which your green infrastructure, the infrastructure of nature around you, is operating in this way that can be understood kind of as a technology. And when you talk about like seeing 16 lanes of traffic bisecting nature, it feels like you're kind of gesturing to that moment where we can feel infrastructure differently and maybe actually see, you know, the rationality of giving rights to nature because they are providing enormous services, etc. These are the kinds of words we use. Could you maybe speak to that feeling that you get, for example, walking along the St. Lawrence River, that there was a technology here that we built our hard infrastructure on top of? Is it possible to, without imagining a deluge of pain, see the kind of stripping away of that, modern infrastructure and the kind of rewilding? Like, is that so far fetched?
It's not far-fetched. It's very difficult. It's so challenging. Like,
Sure.
so I have this phone here, and it pulls me to it all the time.
Yeah.
And I critique it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And up to 2 years ago, I didn't have a phone, but it's very hard in today's world to not have a phone because you can't travel anymore without a phone. And
Right.
and then so I actually got one at that point, and then I made a very concerted effort. I was like, okay, this phone is going to be my landline. I'm going to try to keep it in one spot when I use the phone, because I don't want to be connected all the time.
Right.
I want it to be a technology that makes my life better, but I don't want to be used by the technology.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, like what are these good relationships? And so in the book, A Canadian Climate of Mind, I draw heavily upon John Livingston.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so he was like an early Canadian conservationist. He was one of the founders of the CBC's The Nature of Things, also Canada's first environmental studies program, which is where I did my PhD at York University. He was involved in that. And in his last book called Rogue Primate, which won the Governor's General Award in the mid 1990s somewhere, um, I draw upon some of his ideas in there. And one of the things he talks about in relation to our technology is that it keeps evolving at such a speed that the world around us can never contextualize it.
Yeah.
So we're a perpetual exotic species that's growing and growing and growing, and the world can't actually respond in time to
Mm-hmm.
bring us back in a relational way.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so he talks about the issue with technologies in that way, in the technological imperative, the idea that if a new technology becomes available, we're just going to start using it, and then we worry about the ramifications of it after the fact, and then we try to figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think there's a certain resonance with that, and trying to actually struggle with what that means going forward. When I think about that in relation to, so you're talking about the Red Deal, that book, which I haven't read at the moment, but from what you're talking about, all technologies are, as we're natural. So what we create is natural per se, and so, but it's again like how do they come into our stories, and how our stories tell us how we're going to use them and not use them, um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, how and how our stories are connected to the world themselves, and all those relationships, and inform the use of technologies.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, like our cultures are meant to be a way of bringing us, I think, into some kind of balanced relationship with the world around us. Our
Right.
stories, the different rituals and whatnot, the different ways in which we approach things at different seasons, all of that is meant to bring us into some kind of relationship. And when we don't have that, whenever a kind of ideology just allows technology just to continue to unfold, we get into these situations that we are now, where it's very difficult for any person to really respond. Like, the structural realities of, and again, Scranton, I think Scranton gets at this, the structural realities
Absolutely.
of technologies send us down certain pathways that we may not want to go,
That's
but
right.
all of a sudden we're there.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think, like I remember reading this article by Fikret Berkus, who did a lot of early research around engaging in indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, and bringing that into conservation science. And he was working with Cree in the north, and they were talking about the when guns first came in through trade,
Hmm.
and how in their stories they had integrated how there was a moment in time that that technology made things what we would call unsustainable. They were overhunting,
Right.
and it took a while for them to adapt and bring it into their stories in a way that actually told how they're going to utilize that technology going forward, and so it became part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so the technology is included. So then all of a sudden technology, it becomes like part of the relationship with our natural surround. And the stories are helping them think that forward. Which brings me to I guess to one last thing. And again, this is a critique of sometimes how people tend to approach indigenous knowledge or particular indigenous knowledge systems. When I was working in the north with the Inuit perspectives around climate change, I was engaging for about 5 years in a series of email discussions with JPT Arnikak, who's an Inuit philosopher and writer. He's written children's books. He's also done policy work. And we are engaging in this conversation. He was explaining to me that he wants to change the Inuit knowledge term. So Inuit knowledge at the time was Inuit Kajimatukaji, which translates as Inuit traditional knowledge. He said, I want to get rid of the tuka and just make it Inuit Kajimaji,
Mm.
because that just makes it Inuit knowledge. And he's like, our knowledge is never stuck in the past. It always has to be adapting.
Right.
And in fact, when you look at their stories, like the Inuit culture came out of two distinct cultures during what's known as the Little Ice Age period, and the changes that were happening in the north during that period. During that period, and so the Thule, who are more of a kind of ocean faring people, but when the Little Ice Age came, all of a sudden that was all frozen up in the Arctic. And so they came in, and then were Dorset people who were more like land based kind of cultures, and that shift brought them into these relationships with each other, which weren't all good by any means, according to the stories.
Mm.
But over a couple 100 year period, you have the Inuit culture coming
Right.
out of that, and out of that change, which is another kind of like collapse or cultural change story. Uh, So those no, and you can see the different kinds of knowledges and the different kinds of technologies that those two different peoples had coming into relationship to become what Inuit culture is in different areas around the north. Having those kinds of discussions it's just really interesting, and really being clear that to be static and to have static representations of knowledge
Mm.
is to really be stuck, and to have a static sense of technology as well, where we just kind of operate as whatever comes is going to lead us to the future, is to not put it into a context of all these relationships. Like everything has to be relational, and I think that's where I tend to take a lot of this.
Yeah, and I think like when you enter into a relationship, you one that is built on some kind of responsibility, then I feel as though you're often faced with constraints on your own behavior. Like a lot of the time, that's what you're forced to do is embrace certain limits, other folks' thresholds, right? And, this extractivist relationship to nature has allowed us to largely forget that we
Yeah.
have any limit at all. I mean, the ability to fly wherever you want without considering the consequences feels to me like the most kind of flagrant one. But one of the things that Nick Estes writes about in Our History is the Future is war, right? This, and we're seeing this unbelievable kind of, escalation, brinkmanship in the current moment. What Estes says is that yes, you have, indigenous cultures coming to contact with one another and warring with one another, but he documents how there was an embracing of limits. It wasn't a kind of annihilationist war. There were kind of norms and almost like traditions, regulations, conventions around it that allowed war to be kind of contained, right? And that is the antithesis of what we see today, right? Where it does feel like we're on the cusp of that sort of, or in fact, if you look at Gaza, we are seeing annihilationist violence, and the destruction of the land happening in lockstep. So it's absolutely overwhelming. But these are the things that thinking these two books in relationship to one another got me thinking about. But to kind of because this has been such a dominant thread of what we've been talking about, kind of kind of reinvest in this kind of possibility of learning from traditional indigenous knowledge, or simply indigenous knowledge, without appropriating. It feels to me like the fundamental difference between these two texts is like you make it explicit in yours that while you are, quote, clearly not Mohawk, Wendat, or Métis, there is much in the Haudenosaunee good mind that resonates at the core of your being. That is something that you are not willing to let go of, that you have zero cynicism about. And I just sense a ton of cynicism in Scranton's perspective. Like, for example, he writes that those of us who live in modern, literate, global civilization are incapable of rewilding ourselves, uncivilizing, going native, or decolonizing the Anthropocene. I mean, he says we basically cannot do this. We cannot change at will our rootedness in growth, etc. And that seems to me to be kind of dangerously fatalistic, right? Like, and shutting down of these moments of transformation that I know I've seen in my experience. Like those moments didn't seem performative or appropriative to me. To what extent, like, do you feel like he is foreclosing that? And to what extent do you feel like the corrective he's trying to offer might be useful, at least in terms of trying to undo that very real, I think, settler appropriation of certain kinds of indigenous worldviews for the purpose of just sort of maybe easily explaining away this extractivist relationship to nature? Like, is it responsible of him to try and undermine this like easy gesture to decolonization, or is it in fact the opposite, kind of irresponsible and foreclosing of that possibility?
I guess like with most things, there's good and bad,
Sure.
and and with, I guess, so in general, I'll say like, there was much that I enjoyed in Scranton's work. Like
Mm.
there's a nice narrative to how he approaches and brings in the research and the journey that he's talking about there. Uh,
Absolutely.
and there's a lot of nuance the way in which he engages Tainter's ideas. And what does that mean? And we're not talking full scale. At one point, he says, like, we're not talking about full scale collapse. We're talking about a kind of, at some point, a reorg happens almost. Enough
Yeah.
things collapse and something else is there. And it's like the people are not, the people who are of those previous civilizations have just like figured out a different way to be. Of course, from from like the experience of where the collapse is starting to happen to where they end up being, like there's probably a lot of pain in there.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so there's all that. At the same time, as I read Granton's pieces a couple times because I was feeling very uneasy towards the end.
Yeah.
Uh, and what it was is I was like, I'm feeling trapped.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's nowhere to go. I'm feeling trapped by the kind of ethical pessimism, the way in which we can't really go back. And so there's like, what's the use? all of that. And I was like, well, that's like one of those false dichotomies that I just don't want. I don't want to be dealing with.
Right.
Uh, and but again, like I'm an academic, and so I'm been taught to be critical of what I'm reading, and but even with that, because there are so many discourses like that in academia, I think, uh, where you just kind of feel like you're just left with these kinds of dichotomous decisions.
Hmm.
And I'm just not really, it doesn't really appeal to me. So,
I
so
apologize. My question really gave you an either or, but
no,
I
no,
like that you're pushing back. It's great. Yeah.
no. Like, but so it's like I think it's good. Like, and
Mm-hmm.
it's like what's that about? So like there's still a lot in Scranton that I would draw upon.
Sure.
That I and as I mentioned. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so when I think about, okay, well, how do we approach this? And when I think about this in relation to students around the question of, you're bringing up around appropriation and how do we engage? Uh, I see the relationship as a way to kind of get a vision of like what is possible.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want any of my students to go and pick up something that's not theirs. Like I don't want to do that either.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'll notice, like in all of my writing, I'm always engaging this kind of dialogue where I'm bringing a science perspective into dialogue with Indigenous, and I'm not really researching Indigenous. I'm engaging the dialogue to actually understand why the science isn't working or the policies aren't working, or how do we think about this in a different way? So I'm gonna give two different examples right now. One's going back. I talk about this in a Canadian climate of mind briefly, but it's from my first book, Climate Culture Change, and it was based on a dialogue with JPT Arnikak. And at one point, he said to me, it was probably about 2 or 3 years into our relationship. He said, Tim, you seem like you want to have a bigger perspective on things. Um, and yet, you've not once asked me, from an Inuit perspective, why would wisdom be important in understanding climate change and responding to climate change?
Mm-hmm.
And and I was like, and he's like, you're interested in culture, you're interested in stories, you want to go into those perspectives, and yet you keep on talking about the TEK stuff, the traditional ecological knowledge stuff, which at that point was really big in the literature around Inuit perspectives on climate change. And it's like because those discourses predisposed me in a certain direction, and so I was asking questions like that. Um, and his view, just before I go into this part of the story, was that the TEK, the traditional ecological knowledge, is just basically the resources mentality of Westerners being superimposed onto an Indigenous knowledge system. So he brought up the concept of wisdom because we had been talking about this term sila, this Inuktitut term sila that had come up at various times in the climate science, around as being kind of a translation for weather, in relation to weather changes and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I had remembered, because I have a liberal arts background. I had taken anthropology courses in my undergrad, and I remember taking a religion of anthropology course where we had read Knud Rasmussen, the Danish kind of early ethnographer, and he had been up in the north. And I was like, I remember that term Sila. And so I went back and I found the reference, and then I went and looked for it, and I read more on it. And Sila comes up in a very different way. I'm going to read an actual a
Oh, great.
description of this.
Sounds
This
good.
is this is dictate. This is written by Knud Rasmussen, but he's dictating what this Inuit shaman Nagajanek told him about Sila. Sila is so mighty that his speech to man comes not through ordinary words, but through storms, snowfall, rain showers, the sea, through all the forces that man fears, or through sunshine, calm seas, or small innocent children. When times are good, Sila has nothing to say to mankind. He has disappeared into his infinite nothingness and remains away as long as people do not abuse life but have respect for their daily food. No one has ever seen Sila. His place is so mysterious that he is with us and infinitely far away at the same time.
Hmm.
Okay, so that's a very different sense of Sila from ethnography to what climate science.
Mm-hmm.
JPT Arnikak added, he said, so wisdom is Sila Tunic. Sila Tunic. Tunic means original peoples. So it has to do with, and so then he said, wisdom in our tradition is about a kind of knowledge that realizes that we live in this great contextual mystery that is always responsive to us. And any knowledge that we have and that we actually apply back out into the world through our technologies or our policies or our cultural ways of being will eventually evoke some kind of response from the world back around us.
Mm-hmm.
Wisdom is being able to attend to that and then be responsive to that.
Right.
And so how did Nagajanek come to this sense of wisdom, of Sila? Well, he had to go out into the people who were initiating him in to become this kind of shaman, this knowledge holder. Took him out for 30 days to be out on the tundra by himself. And he would bring him a little bit of water and a little bit of dried meat here and there. And he said, like, somewhere after, he didn't know how long he was out there, all of a sudden he heard Sila talk to him. And that was a particular experience that allowed, in that particular knowledge system, to get a wider perspective on the kind of world we live within. And, we need people like that. We don't need everybody to be people like that, but we need people who can actually get a different sense of the world and have all of your cultural perceptions basically break down for a moment so you can actually see something else. That's what happens when you're out in those spaces. Now, I'm going to compare that just for one moment, side by side. I'm currently writing a book that's based upon, it's in a dialogue with Thomas Merton's work, who was like a Trappist monk. He was a hermit. The last 10 years or so of his life, he spent a lot of time out in nature and really started transforming his perspectives on the world. He says at one point, this for me is so resonant with the Sila Tunic thing. He says solitude is as necessary for society as silence is for language, and air for the lungs, and food for the body. A community that seeks to invade or destroy the spiritual solitude of individuals who compose it is condemning itself to death by spiritual asphyxiation. When society fails to provide sufficient solitude to develop the inner life of the persons who compose it, they rebel and seek false solitudes. A false solitude is a point of vantage from which an individual who has been denied the right to become a person takes revenge on society by turning his individuality into a destructive weapon. True solitude is found in humility, which is infinitely rich. False solitude is refuge of pride. False solitude is self-centered. And because it finds nothing in its own center, it seeks to draw all things into itself. But everything it touches becomes infected with its own nothingness and falls apart. Like, he's not talking about solitude as like we all need to be there all the time. But we need some space in our lives to get a sense of who we are. And we're always attached to the technologies around us and to the discourses that are in those technologies, the algorithms, and we're on them all the time. Then we deal with all kinds of other mental health issues, if you want.
I mean, quantifiably, this is true.
Exactly. Yeah. And so with the interesting thing with Merton, he spent the last 10 years or so trying to find more and more solitude to basically get a deeper sense of who he was. But what actually happened is then he became very actively involved with the civil rights movement. He became very actively involved in interfaith dialogues he was specific, with other practitioners, Buddhist monks, Sufis, and also indigenous knowledge systems. And he wrote about the dialogue and how that dialogue transformed his sense of his own tradition. So for me, he's an example. I was like, hey, I'm not interested in a new religion. I don't know how that works. I
Mm.
want to draw. So I ask my students, try to find something that you can actually work with in your own tradition, whatever tradition you come from, and bring it into dialogue that they can actually have a dialogue with it and learn with these other traditions. So he's an example for me. It's like, oh, I'm going to be on a journey with him and he's kind of like an ancestor that's kind of leading me on a path. And it's like, oh, he's not perfect by any means.
Hmm.
But as I learned from Indigenous teachers, elders are not supposed to be perfect either. They are not saints.
Yeah.
They are people who have lived a particular life and have tried to follow a set of teachings that keep on teaching them.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I hear that. And I do feel as though it's a little bit like a Western settler thing to imagine, the individual as genius or as master, right? That idea of mastery is something that really seeps in subtly. Wisdom and fallibility and humility, fundamentally different worldview, you could argue, right? And yeah, there's such a difference between what you just read and what I encountered just recently on social media. And I don't know if this is a useful comparison, but I think it might be. Elizabeth Colbert, writer of The Sixth Extinction and Under a White Sky, she was on The Daily Show promoting her book, and she said something kind of similar about the context in which we live and trying to be attuned to it and trying to be humble and wise about attempting, at least, to live in balance with it. She said, effectively, the Holocene, we can think about it as roughly, 10,000 years of relative climate stability. And she says, she kind of raises the rhetorical question of like, if you are faced with, uncommon climate stability, wouldn't you want to preserve that? And yet, what we've done in this resourcist or extractivist mode of modernity is figure out multiple ways of destabilizing it, of destroying it effectively, of destabilizing the biosphere. But it seems to me like, me as an individual watching that video clip and experiencing some kind of a relationship to the thinker that is trying to, like, imbue me with this feeling of like almost dissonance, but also humility in that moment. It's so different from what you're describing, I think, which is about seeking a certain kind of solitude, self reflexivity, I don't know, as a means of being better equipped to find others, right? And to form solidarities. Colbert's formulation left me feeling like there is a fatalism that we're just swept up in. But I feel like we can maybe, hone in on this current political conjuncture in Canada a little bit in relationship to this, because one one approach or one response to this new liberal budget, which doubles down on fossil fuels, and the memorandum of understanding with Alberta, which basically condemns us to carbon bombs across the board. One response is the response that Stephen Guilbeault and Catherine Abreu are taking, which is just leave, just say no, get out of there, disconnect, and maybe not retreat, but at least abandon these sites of like official power. But what you say in the book is that Canada's energy politics participates in a kind of maladaptation by increasing not only potential economic instability but also social polarization and divisiveness. And I just think, like, in general, what this book offers, and that I don't see in a lot of other books, is like a diagnosis of Canada's energy psyche almost, where when faced even with catastrophic wildfires, we double down. It seems impossible. But as you say, the bitumen resource requires extensive economic, social, and environmental investment for diminishing returns. How are you, almost 10 years later, dealing with the fact that your book is still so painfully relevant when it comes to diagnosing this like addiction to oil in Canada? And is it possible? Do you see any possibility of trying to kind of break that addiction? Given this like habitual doubling down that we tend to do.
yeah, it's that's it's a poignant and strong and big
It's big.
question.
It's big.
Uh, where I first go, and where I've been going over the past year of Trump being in power, um, and the Canadian response to Trump being in power.
Hmm.
Uh, it is like, yeah, the stuff that I was talking about in that book, the dynamics I was talking about in that book, and I do talk a lot about the history of America, the colonial histories around the American Revolution in relation to Canadian resource development and the Canadian nation state and all of that's in there. But what really struck me over the past year uh, is a kind of like, again, it's an indigenous understanding, that like, if we don't honor the ancestors kind of own us.
Mm.
Like, if we don't really have a sense of like how the ancestors are here right now, and actually really think about it and reflect on it, so that in some sense, their stories become teachers for us as to what we want to do and what we don't want to do. And what I mean in relation to that is, so Trump comes into power. He makes all these insinuations about Canada being the 51st state.
Mm.
Clearly, there's question. He wants the resources. The Ring of Fire, the oil sands, all that, the water, the
Water.
hydroelectricity. There are all kinds of reasons why that would be a good thing for them. Um, and then we have our election happening, and all this Canada First stuff comes up, and Carney comes in and wins the election. And what's the response is, with this first budget, as you're highlighting, it's like, it's Ring of Fire, mineral extraction, it's pipelines, and the kind of like, when I look at it in the context of the history, this is just like the 1800s all over again. This is, let's Canadian nation state. We got to build the Canadian nation state. Let's build the railroad out west, because we got to get there before the U.S.
Hmm.
That's the way in which we'll keep them south of us.
Yeah.
Post the war 1812 and all of that, and so, like, we're doing something very similar. The dynamic is really, really interesting, and even the way in which Trump brought up how weird the border is, like the line for the border. You
Yeah.
remember.
Saying it's made up. It's just a
Yeah,
made up thing. Yeah.
it's a made up thing, and yeah, sure, it is a made up thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
As all borders are. Uh,
Right.
so so there's this. It's like, so the history of Canada was historically based upon resource extractivism. Those railroads were about building the economy based upon staples, and I draw upon Harold Innis's work and whatnot.
Which I
Uh,
found fascinating. I wasn't familiar with his like environmental writing on resources and energy. It's stunning
yeah,
that he calls Canada an economically weak country. That too feels prophetic given the current moment that we're in and the one that you're describing.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and the aim to make us economically strong
Mm. Hmm.
is based upon further extraction of resources,
Yeah.
and then globally connecting it. And so we're following very, these deep troughs, cultural troughs, if you want, of like how we approach things as a culture.
Hmm.
And yet we know, as you talked about earlier in our discussion, it's quite clear, like how is that going to connect with where we need to be going as a society? Like, where, we know all of this is not going to bring us to a sustainable future.
Hmm.
And yet we keep on going down, kind of hoping, so that it's a kind of false hope, which is not the kind of hope that we want to be engaging in, kind of hoping that the gambler's hope,
Yeah.
if you want.
We want substantive hope. We want a materially founded hope.
Yeah.
Um, But this
Yeah.
is Scranton's impasse, right? This is what you're talking about, is that feeling of stuckness. And I personally do not feel that I'm not ready to let go of this conceptual rethinking of what you talk about in the book in relationship to like Ontario Hydro and this use of science and technology to unlock nature's bounty. Like, I'm not ready to let go of the power of rethinking nature as this endless bounty of free gifts. Like, I think there's value in rethinking that. It maybe doesn't reach the halls of power, and it maybe doesn't change policy, but in terms of building a movement, these histories and these concepts, I think, have actual purchase, in our current moment. And yeah, that's why I found your book so valuable.
And again, so the way I talk to students about this, uh, so I'm teaching in social work. Like what does this have to do with with social work? And it has to do with all the kind of the emotional connections, thinking about climate justice,
Mm-hmm.
all of those pieces. Um, but I have to clarify for students, okay, like because the students when they take those courses and they do their sit spots, and then they're doing their sit spots in relation to like the most recent research on the mental health benefits of being out in nature and what's actually happening in the brain. Or then we do one. You have to go find a spot along water, and there we're going to be talking about earth grief, all the literature on ecological grief and earth grief, and actually ask you to reflect and feel that a bit, let it in, and and so each week is these different pieces where they have to do this relationship. And overall, most students are profoundly transformed because you're talking about a social work profession that is very anthropocentric, very human centric, and there's probably no other course except for the course where we do truth and reconciliation for social workers and look at social work's involvement in residential schools, child welfare system, removal of people, the impacts on to basically access land. uh, that's probably the only place they'll ever engage like land. And here it's like, oh, we're extending that. We're thinking about it in relation to climate change, but we're also realizing, oh, there are all these valid relationships, and you got to engage yourself. And then I have to tell students, okay, don't expect any of your jobs to have any space for this, because most of your agencies are not going to do this. So our final project is because they have to do field practicums and things like that. I would say, I want you to think about your field practicum or the potential area where you want to be working, and I want you to find one way where you can begin working this into the established system that's already there. Because I want you to find hope for this, and so this is a guide for change. And the change we're interested in is not going to happen tomorrow, but you need to be part of it in your relationships with others. And you need to trust that if you can do something and somebody else is going to do something and somebody else is going to do something, you don't have to be the solution. You just need to do something that actually feels good and that you like doing and that you think will be helpful for the clients you're engaging. And start there. Don't try to be the solution for everybody. Do it in your own particular place, and find that. And so their last project is actually about kind of creating this guide for themselves on how they're going to, and something they can refer back to, and where they can push. What policies can they utilize to kind of like use as a kind of like a hammer to open up spaces. And then try to find ways to continue fostering those relationships with the natural places around them in their daily lives, and to do it with family, like to do it, so like I don't want them to go and do something. Oh, we're going to go up north to some places as a class. I don't want them to do that. I want them to do it in a place where they could actually be walking with their parents or with their children or with their friends.
Mm-hmm.
And it opens up a place for communication, for dialogue on the different things that they're interested in, not in a way where they're proselytizing, but just in a way to have a dialogue, like how we're having a dialogue. And so I think, I guess, so going back to where your question started, uh, we can't fully disengage the institutions. I think I agree with Scranton on some level where I don't want I don't want like everything to collapse and everybody's
Yep.
dying all over the place. Like, it's like we're
Right.
that's not the option that I want to live in. I don't want my kids to live in that. I can see where things are going. It doesn't make me feel good.
Mhm.
But I want to create options at the margins of our institutions where something else could potentially, uh, in the right environment, the right kind of situation, could potentially take hold.
Mhm.
And so always trying to work in the margins, not in the center, on the
Yeah.
edges.
Yeah, and try to recognize what they argue beautifully in The End of This World, that co-authored text by, I think it's like six different authors, including, Emily Eaton and Angel Luc, that, change is not linear. Right? Like things can happen in a nonlinear way. A kind of rupture can take place, and then there are openings. There are openings in those moments. COVID, I think, for Scranton was, and Arundhati Roy famously kind of described COVID as a portal. And she says, we can walk through that portal carrying with us our data centers and dead ideas, or we can try and renew. And for Scranton, COVID in particular was a collapse that revealed the problem of complexity and the kind of unsustainability of how complex our systems are, right? But it revealed other things too, I think, right? And I think it revealed the kinds of care networks, for example, that are possible, and the ways in which like letting in the reality that we are porous beings can totally transform our relationship to nature, right? The recognition that 70% of emerging infections are zoonotic spillover, and that like as we encroach on nature, these will be more and more of the impacts that we'll see. Like that has to have changed some of us, right? Our perception of the world. So yeah, on the one hand, absolutely, there was this kind of reconstitution of these, or not even reconstitution, a kind of like acceleration of many of these corporate institutions that have just ballooned into these behemoths that really do threaten, I think, survival. But there was this other thing that happened at the level of noticing, attunement, sociality, and so on. And I think like this is certainly one of the things that I take away from your book is that feeling that attunement has to be an embodied thing. It's not purely intellectual. You have to actually kind of exist in relationship to other people, exist in relationship to nature in order to actually feel what I'm describing, right? Which is that conceptual reframing. And I take that point. I think it's been a slow education for me in terms of like embracing the reality of that. But I think it's as you say, a kind of guide. And I like that idea of like, first of all, what a wonderful final assignment to have to create a guide to almost like preserve you later on, a survival kit for your future in social work. It's a cool idea.
It goes to one of your other podcasts, the one you had with Killian York.
Right.
Um, and at a few different moments, he makes it really clear that there are different kinds of knowledges,
Right.
and we need to better recognize that there are different kinds of knowledges. Everything doesn't have to be like the rational, logical
Mm-hmm.
perspective on things.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so, whenever I do that with my students, if I'm going to actually give time to go out and to say, okay, you're going to actually have to foster a relationship with the world around you, and I'm going to give you some different guidance of how to do that. I actually asked them to try to find a kind of a guide that might be relevant to them, in relation to their culture, or so like how Merton is for me in some ways, or John Livingston was in the past, to actually foster that. But to do that and to say, okay, you need to do that, but then at the same time, you need to read the same amount of academic articles that we would do in any other class,
Mm-hmm.
is to make for extra work and make it impossible. And so to so I love thinking. Obviously, you can tell in my work, I engage a lot of different thinkers. I'm bringing them forward, but it's always a task in academia to go put our different our predispositions on particular kinds of knowledges in their place, in their relational place. Uh, and I was lucky. I had my PhD supervisor who was he was originally a fisherman from the East Coast, from Nova Scotia, and did his PhD when the fisheries collapsed in the 80s, and whatnot. And he was like, he had a history background, and he always said to me, because he saw my previous, like, I like thinking about things. He's like, no talking heads here, no talking heads. I want it to be grounded in histories, in people's voices that are actually embodied in some way. And so when you bring the talking heads in, I want you to embody them in some way. I want you to actually contextualize them. I want you to put, he didn't want just philosophy for philosophy's sake, per se. And so I've had moments with people like that I try to impress upon my students. Like, I want you to actually learn that the natural world around us is not simply a text, but it is a source of knowledge. And to say that, you need to actually foster space to be able to, as much space as you would give to reading or to being on your machines. And cut back on that, open space for this, and see what else can come up. And I want you to actually reference your journal. I want you to bring in what you're feeling and what you're thinking in relationship to the literature. So it's a beginning of kind of trying to foster different kinds of knowledge for them. But we need to actually do that in our educational spaces. Then we need to do that in our institutional spaces, and in our lived lives. And it's very difficult because we always have to push back against the technologies that get us caught in our head more often than not, and get caught us in these various traps that we've been talking about.
Yeah. No, there's this really overwhelming, almost like messianic language around AI, for example, as the technology that will unlock a whole set of insights that will solve these crises, which is a thing that Jorg, in our conversation and in his book, Ecological Reasoning, says is absolute nonsense. I mean, when you're talking about AI, you're talking about the replication, for the most part, of human ways of learning. Yeah. So there's like a finite limit to what that can yield up. And yet, he says, we are still trusting technology. We are still advocating trusting the science without having that kind of attempt to critically keep it at arm's length, to our detriment, right? And that's why I absolutely resonate with this feeling of like there's more value perhaps in groundedness, in messiness, in muddiness, and in that sort of epistemology. So thanks so much again. It's been a treat talking to you. And yeah, we'll hopefully be able to talk more in the future as this book comes into form. Be happy to look at it.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Scott, for having me. It's been a joy getting to know your work and having this discussion today.